And we've really tried to, on two fronts, promote what's going on in Minnesota to the rest of the hockey world, because I think there's so much that we can learn from it. Because in a lot of play, like I'm based in Vancouver, like there's a lot of families spending north of $6,000 a year for their kids to play U8 hockey.
Okay, welcome in. This is episode 23 of the Individual Skills Hockey Podcast. My name is Miles Deeth, and we are lucky to be joined with Aaron Wilbur today. He's the founder of the Coaches site. Aaron, how you doing today? And thank you for joining us.
Hey, I'm great, Miles. Thanks for having me, man.
All right, so why don't you give a little background on your coaching? I've done my research, but wanting to let the listeners know about kind of how you got started in coaching, and then maybe if you want to dive into how this Coaches site platform came to be.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I'll start with the coaching. So I was really fortunate. I wasn't a great player. I played a little bit of junior hockey, but discovered, at 18 that I wasn't going to be a professional hockey player. And there was probably two really kind of inflection points in my life. 18, I find out I wasn't going to be a hockey player. Was just kind of fell into coaching organically. Was really lucky to coach in the BCHL for a number of years. Got into the agent business briefly, back into coaching. And then at 28, I was hired as an assistant coach with UBC, the University of British Columbia, with their men's program. And I had always sort of said I was going to give myself till I was 30 to figure out if this coaching thing had some legs to it career-wise. And at 30, I realized that, I'd been moving around every year or two. I was living in Vancouver. For anybody that hasn't been here, it's a great city. And I was like, man, I don't know if I really want to leave this to keep chasing this thing that may or may not materialize. And so at 30, I realized I wasn't going to be a professional coach either. And that was certainly my aspirations. But, I was in a position where I needed to sort out what was next. And while I did that, I said, I'm going to start a coaching conference. And the reason I felt that was going to be important or valuable was because when I was at UBC, I was offered the opportunity to be a coach mentor for Vancouver minor hockey. And that involved going out on the ice, probably really similar, frankly, to your job before there was hockey director. So just going out to practice, running some clinics. And what dawned on me is that a lot of the coaches I was working with, who were super passionate, loved hockey, loved coaching, they were doing a lot of the same things my coaches did with me when I was growing up. Meanwhile, the game had evolved significantly. And I think the expectations of coaches did and have continued to grow significantly. And, one day a coach in one of these clinics I was putting on put his hand up and said, hey, like, where do you learn all this stuff? And I was always really transparent in that, these weren't my ideas. These were ideas that I had stolen from coaches much smarter and more experienced than me. And I said, gosh, you meet up with coaches at events, you go to clinics, et cetera. And he's like, clinics? He's like, well, like where are these clinics? And at the time there was the Roger Nielsen Clinic, which was hosted in Windsor, Ontario. Obviously USA Hockey and Hockey Canada would host their kind of coach education type seminars. But there was a real benefit in being at one of these events where there was no agenda. It was just like, we're sharing ideas. We get to hang out. There's not a test to let you know if you pass or fail. You just got to come in and soak it up. And so I said, I'm going to start a coaching conference in Vancouver. This is 2011. And at the time it wasn't a business. I didn't have any sort of tech background. It was very much just, this is what's going to allow me to stay involved in the game while I figure out what's next for me in my professional life. Meanwhile, we had 98 coaches show up in year one. Year two, coaches started flying in. We had over 200 coaches attend. Then we started a blog. We got on Twitter, and it really just sort of grew organically. And before you knew it, we had this community that was really into what we were doing.
So talk about those first couple conferences. How did you get presenters? How did you get the content that made it such a success early on? I'm listening to you talk and I'm like, well, I want to do something like that at Wayzata. So how do you make those? How do you get those people to come?
Well, first off, like I wasn't qualified to organize a 10-year-old's birthday party, when we started that first one. But it was really just through some personal relationships. Like I'd been coaching for a while. It's funny, like our very first presenter was Ryan Huska, who's now the head coach of the Calgary Flames. And at the time he was the head coach of the Kelowna Rockets. Him and I had a relationship. Trying to think, that first year Ray Ferraro spoke. I had coached his oldest son in junior hockey, so had a relationship with him. Mike Johnson, assistant coach on Canada's World Junior team, was in Portland at the time. So, and I think what happened was a lot of these coaches that spoke, and this continues to happen to this day, they recognize, whether it's our event, our website, or other coaching platforms, that when they were coming up, the opportunity to learn from coaches that were more experienced was so integral in their own development. It's not a big ask for them to say, hey, do you want to come and pay it forward to that next sort of generation of coaches? And so in a lot of cases, it's the coaches that attend our events. It's them advocating for us to their friends, other coaches on their staff, to come and participate. And I would also add, I think that whether you're an NHL coach, a skills coach, whomever, the opportunity to take what you know and present it in a room full of your peers, I think is an invaluable opportunity just to develop yourself as a presenter, as a speaker, etc., and really sharpen how you communicate.
Well, yeah, not only that too, and whatever you're presenting on, you better know that so well.
Inside and out, yeah.
And then also they get to attend the conference and watch everybody else speak and connect with them too. So you have that kind of networking. So that's awesome. Um, in my job as a hockey director at Wyzetta, I've started recommending the coaches site to all of our coaches more and more, and I'm starting to gain a sense that it has become more popular at every level,
Mhm.
all the way down to 6U, 8U hockey. How do you advise when you're talking to a group or a club or association? How do you advise that coaches first start using the site?
So what I recommend is that they start with a search bar. And I think what's great now is we've been doing this long enough, and especially now that users of the platform, pardon me, can come in and share their own content. I mean, you can search just about anything. Like you could search, like, how to catch a backhand pass, and you're gonna get videos and articles, etc., on that topic. And so I recommend you start there. I think it's really important, and goes without saying, that uh, any coach at any level being mindful of who you're teaching and what their abilities are is so critical. And so what I mean by that is that, if you're an initiation coach or squirt coach, and you come in and see, I think it was this last year, Pete DeBoer, head coach of the Dallas Stars, his presentation on how they play offensively in Dallas was one of our most popular, and it's awesome.
Right.
But if the expectation is that a squirt coach is going to take that presentation and then try and translate that to a bunch of 7-year-olds, it's probably not going to go very well. However, there are principles in that presentation that can be pulled out and applied to kids at that age, like some of those little tiny details. So, that's certainly something that we encourage. But at the same time, we recognize that we feel a real responsibility to create content that applies to coaches at all levels of the game. And we have the benefit now, we've got over 30,000 users across 66 countries. And so we get to have conversations. And frankly, Miles, it's people like yourself that reach out to us and say, this is what we need. These are the gaps, or here's sort of the questions I'm getting from my coaches. Can you guys try and address these areas? And we listen, and then it's on us to try and go and create those resources.
Yeah, and I've had the same exact experience when I watch an NHL coach presentation on your site, and I try to bring it to high school practice that day. And the first couple of times I did that, I brought everything from the presentation. But when you make a great point. I think there was one on recently about defending for undersized defensemen, and
Yes.
it goes through the very basic principles of stick out, stick on puck, where is your stick, all that stuff, and you can teach that to 8U players if you wanted to. So I think it's really important for new coaches that are diving into the site to be mindful of that. I guess I'll say so.
For sure.
Um, so some of my favorite stuff on the site has been stuff about the non-hockey stuff. A couple episodes I had John O'Sullivan on this podcast talking about his Changing the Game project and what he does. I know there's one on social media that was recent.
Yeah.
Has there been a push from your side of including more and more of these kind of non-hockey leadership type content in the site?
For sure. And a big part of that, one, I think it's, myself and the rest of our team of the coaches say, we're just, incredibly curious about, you know, a what makes a great coach tick. We believe strongly that a positive experience with sport is invaluable to a young person, and that experience, I mean, frankly, an association can do everything right. They could have the best schedule. They can, handle all the jerseys on time. They can do everything right. But if the coach doesn't deliver a great experience, then the kids and families likely aren't going to have a very good experience themselves. So, the coaches are kind of the gatekeepers to that experience for kids. And, the other side of it is that, when we talk, again, to people like yourself with our association partners, and we talk to them about like, who's your best coach? What makes them a great coach? It's never about the X's and O's. It's always about them making sure that all the players feel included. It's always that they have great communication with the parents. It's always that regardless of the wins or losses, that they've set standards and expectations outside of that everybody can gravitate towards. So even if the team has a losing record, like, um, you know, what is going to be deemed a successful season has nothing to do with the results in the standings. And so we look at that and say, okay, well, how can we, are these actionable traits, or is this just that some people, are great youth coaches and some people aren't, or can this be taught? And what we learned in research is like, through meeting people like, mentioned John O'Sullivan and, we've had a number, Dr. Jody Carrington. If you're a minor hockey coach, you haven't watched Dr. Jody Carrington's presentation on our site, then you need to go do it immediately. That a lot of these traits they're actionable, they can be taught. And so we wanted to make those accessible. And I think, Miles, you can probably relate to this. You're going to have a lot of youth coaches that are volunteers, super passionate. They might not have a lot of experience in hockey, but that's the part that you can probably help take care of.
Sure.
It's those other parts of how they show up with the kids. That's the part that's ultimately going to make them feel successful. And the byproduct of that is they feel successful. If they feel like they have something to give, they're probably going to stick around your association for a number of years, which, is just going to enhance, the experience that you offer your membership.
Right. And I think it's really important to allow coaches to grow in that area too. I think a lot of times, because it's been the area that I've developed the most as a coach too, is the non-hockey stuff. And a lot of times coaches start out and they fall down a few times in those types of softer areas. And a lot of times we don't let them get better at it, I guess is my point. So
It's a great point. And I would add, like, I think that there is more pressure in coaching youth sports today than there ever has been. And if we think that, any volunteer coach is going to come in and just naturally be equipped to handle, the pressures from parents, all the expectations that come with it, I think that's really unfair. So I think it's important that, people like yourself, associations, are proactive and supporting their coaches and giving them some resources to help, manage everything that comes with coaching youth sports.
right. Just talk a little bit about the new platform where coaches can create their own content. I don't know if you have a specific name for it. I've seen 2.0. Is that what it's called? Or
We just call it the coaches site now. I think it's just kind of,
okay.
now people are familiar with it, but yeah, it's funny. I read an article. This is probably around 2018. and it was a profile on Sportsnet, which is kind of in Canada, like our ESPN.
Yep.
And it was a profile on a club called Modo, which is located about 600 kilometers north of Stockholm in Sweden. And Modo is really unique. And just for anybody that's not familiar, like in Europe, hockey is very much like the soccer or football model, meaning that, the pro team runs academies right down at the youth levels, and they're incentivized to develop players that are eventually going to play on their professional team because they don't have a draft. So the better your development system, the better your pro team is going to be in the long run. And so Modo was really unique in that this little town of, 40,000 people. So you mentioned Mankato. It's about the size of Mankato.
Mm-hmm.
They had produced Peter Forsberg, Marcus Naslund, the Sedin twins, Victor Hedman. And that's just, scraping the surface. There's a number of players that played on their national team. And so, the question is like, how are they doing it? So this profile, the youth system there, and in particular, a coach named Anders Melinder, who had coached all these kids in youth hockey, and he'd been a volunteer coach at the program for, decades. And, I remember reading that and I was like, man, I'm like, we're out here trying to, get NHL coaches and the best coaches in the world on our stage. But, when it comes to serving youth coaches, maybe it's Anders Melinder who we should be paying attention to. And he's the person, well, nobody's really probably knows who he is. He probably has so much to offer, just given his, breadth of experience. So we started looking at it and saying, with one of these things, smartphone, could a coach like Anders go out and share his coaching IP, so to speak. So we set out to build a platform. If nobody's been on it before, I would sort of compare it to LinkedIn, meaning that you can come on, you can consume our content. You get a locker space where you can save that content, because that was a really important element that we recognized that, coaches back in the day all had binders, but coaching content, didn't live in analog. It lived in digitally now. And so we needed to create a digital binder. And we wanted to create a space where coaches could come in and share their best ideas. We felt they would be motivated to do so. And it's proven to be, accurate that, again, we've got coaches on a daily basis that, share drills, share coaching ideas, share problems and challenges they're having, ways that they've figured out how to solve them. And, gosh, I would just look in Minnesota, Miles, like, can you imagine if like every youth coach in Minnesota shared like one drill, one idea,
Right.
with all the other coaches in the state, how much, I mean, listen, Minnesota's, I think doing a tremendous job in terms of player development and hockey as a whole, but
Yeah.
all that's going to do is just elevate everybody. And I think that for most of us, we all love to win hockey games, but I think we're all in this because we want to see the sport thrive, not just in our own communities, but around the world.
Yeah. And it's speaking from experience in Minnesota. There's certain programs that you just look at and you're like, why are they always good? Why, what are they doing? And it's like, it's somewhat of a mystery sometimes when you just, I mean, you literally have to just call them up and ask them. Or so I think something like this could be super helpful and all this stuff. So I love your podcast, Glass and Out podcast. For those that don't know, tell us just a little bit about how that got started and what you've learned from it and how it's enhanced your kind of understanding of all things hockey.
Oh man, it's I kind of compare it, for me, it's like going to church every week. Like, I get to learn from not just great people in our game, but just people that live their life to an incredibly high standard. I think it's made me a better husband, a better father, a better friend. Certainly, better at my, 9 to 5 job. And, I think what we learn, or what I've learned from it, is that, if you want to be a coach, coaching's not like if you wanted to be a doctor, let's say, and or accountant, and you were in high school, like, I'm not suggesting that it would be easy.
Yeah.
However, what you could do is you could say, hey, if I finish with this GPA in high school, that's going to help me get into this university with this program. And as long as I complete, reach this sort of academic standard, that's going to allow me to get a degree, which is, if I graduate from this school, get a good job, et cetera. Like, you can kind of map that out.
Right.
Coaching is the total opposite of that.
Yeah.
Coaching is basically like jumping off a cliff and trying to assemble a parachute on the way down. and you don't know. And I think that we've learned that in cases where, I mentioned Ryan Huska with the Calgary Flames. Like, I'll tell you what, when he got the head coaching gig in Calgary, and it just, life's funny, right? Like, he ended up the 2 weeks after he got named the head coach, he came and spoke again at our conference, which is now at Ann Arbor or University of Michigan. And I mean, I was so excited for him because, in that span of 13 years, watching him grind it out and go from, head coach to assistant coach, moving his family, like, it's such a commitment, and you don't know that you're going to get that call. At the same time, I would look at, we've had the opportunity through our partnership with the Minnesota High School Coaches Association, like so many of the coaches at that level, like, coaching's not, it's not something they do off the side of their desk. It's something they live, breathe. It's an important part of who they are, how they identify, and so I think that's what I've kind of taken away from it. Is it's a craft. It's something it's a continuous work in progress. There's always more to learn, and I would say more than anything is how humble the best coaches are.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that we can all learn from.
Yeah, and how generous they are with their time, obviously.
Absolutely. Totally.
You mentioned that we kind of live this craft or whatever, and it just reminded me of a story of our parent meeting for our high school team this year. We all have to get up and introduce ourselves as the coaching staff, and I said something like, I grew up in Wayzata, so I played, since I was 5 all the way up through high school, and
That's so
so
cool.
I said something like, only 4 years of my life I wasn't on a Wayzata hockey team, so this is basically all I think about. And one of the assistant coaches turned and he goes, "Come on, you think about other things." And I had to catch myself. I was like, "Yeah, I have a family and all that stuff," but it was just my instinct to be like, "Well, this is, all I care about is Wayzata hockey." So,
And that's amazing, because I think that's how most coaches feel, right? Like,
yeah.
I'm just like, listen, I coach my son's U7 team, and I don't know how many times, like, my wife catches me like staring off into the distance. She's like, "You're thinking about practice again, aren't you?" And I'm like, "I can't help it. I can't help
Exactly.
it." Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to get your take on some Minnesota hockey stuff. As an outsider, not growing up here, you've talked to countless people. You mentioned Finland. You've
Yeah.
experienced the Canadian kind of system. What's your just general impression of Minnesota hockey, and since you've been doing this?
Gosh. So I would say that the first thing that comes to mind is, I think from, and I'm probably down in Minnesota about twice a year
Okay.
at different hockey events. And we've got a partnership with Minnesota Hockey as well. And, the first thing is, I think Minnesota hockey, like, it's very incubated, meaning I don't believe that a lot of hockey folks, whether it's, parents, coaches, administrators, I think they just assume that the way hockey is in Minnesota is the way it is everywhere. And
Right.
nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah.
Um, and so the first thing that stands out is that, one, the amount of volunteers you have across all roles, positions, so coaches, administrators, etc. I mean, um, good luck getting people to volunteer to the extent that you do in Minnesota. And, there's a lot of positive results from that. But the obvious one is that it really reduces the cost. And I think that that's one thing that stands out to me is hockey in Minnesota. Like, it's very, folks are very mindful at the administrative level that every decision they make is either going to increase the cost of playing hockey or potentially reduce it. And I think they're very mindful at not increasing the costs if they don't have to. So that's one. Two, I think from a, just a structural standpoint, when you just like look at the season, I mean, really, it's kind of done ass backwards compared to everywhere else in the world. Like, your minor hockey season doesn't start until October.
Right.
Like, in most places in Canada, tryouts are starting in August and the first week of September at the latest. And I think that goes for a lot of places in the world. You're playing a shorter schedule. Um, you know, there's a real onus on ensuring that there's space for kids to play other sports. Where again, in most parts of the world, hockey is a 365 day a year endeavor, even at like for young kids.
Right.
And meanwhile, and we've dug really deep on this. when you look at the amount of players, and we'll use NHL players just because that's the easiest thing to measure. But if we measure Division I hockey players, we'd get this, we'd see the same sort of results.
Yep.
But if we look at NHL players per capita, the state of Minnesota produces more NHL players per capita than anywhere in North America. And it's not even close yet. Kids, theoretically play less structured hockey. They do have the benefit of playing outdoors a lot. So there's a lot of free play.
Yep.
And I guarantee you that free play, that opportunity for kids to go out and play without coaches around, they can nobody's blowing the whistle and saying, hey, Miles, like no backhand passes at the blue line or get the puck out. Like the fact that they can go play and be creative is really unique. And I think it's something that, through our work, and I don't know if you know Mike Sneeg, who used to be the director of Minnesota hockey, was the executive director of college hockey. He's now the vice president of the Minnesota Wild Foundation. Mike's a really good friend. He's spoken for us a number of times, and we've really tried to, on two fronts, promote what's going on in Minnesota to the rest of the hockey world, because I think there's so much that we can learn from it. Because in a lot of play, like I'm based in Vancouver, like there's a lot of families spending north of $6,000 a year for their kids to play U8 hockey,
right?
Which is crazy, and it's not sustainable. We know this. At the same token, we want to try and communicate what's going on in Minnesota to the folks in Minnesota, so they recognize, like, hey, how special it is, what a great job folks like you are doing, and to make sure that you continue leading into that, that community mindset, that volunteer mindset that, I think in Minnesota, like there's so many people that are a part of what makes it great and ultimately so successful.
Right. And Mike Sneeze, I know one of his biggest points every time I've listened to him talk is that we treat our rinks here like public parks, and they operate at a loss, which is, I don't think it needs to be underlined a few times to everyone listening that is not normal around the world. So
it isn't. And I would say another point that the Mike has highlighted to me, and this is really sunk in from a player development perspective, is because kids in Minnesota, I'm not saying that they don't want to play in the National Hockey League, but my sense is that, a kid growing up in Minnesota, like when they go to bed at night, they're dreaming about playing for their high school team. And because they're going to play in their community, they're not going to join these super teams or these youth all-star teams, is that you have more talent spread out across more associations. And so you got more kids getting a chance to play on the power play. You got more kids with an opportunity to touch the puck in crucial situations. You have more kids that have the opportunity to be leaders amongst their peers. And that's probably the reason why on opening night, the NHL this year, where there was over 50 Minnesota born and developed players in the National Hockey League, and they represented over 30 high schools, which is remarkable, because what's happening everywhere else in the world is we're just creating these little super teams,
right.
Younger and younger ages. Like in Ontario, they just removed all the borders. So in Ontario next year, you're going to be able to play for anywhere you want. And what's going to happen is they're going to have these teams that they're going to assemble these super teams. They're going to kick the wheels off everybody. And that's going to feel really good when you're 9 and 10. The problem is the fourth line player on that team is never going to play on the power play like he would if he had to just stayed home in his association, or like he would in Minnesota, and might, when it matters, when he's 16, 17, 18, have the opportunity to realize his potential, get the opportunity to showcase that, and ultimately maybe get a scholarship, and who knows where that takes him.
It's been brought up to me, and I haven't really done a whole lot of research on it, but one of the, I guess, counterpoints to how we do things in Minnesota is, yes, we have the most numbers at the NHL or Division I level, but do we have the first round NHL draft picks, the guys that go in the top 5 or 10? And the argument kind of goes, well, we don't have these academies that are catering to that type of talent when they're teen years. And so because of that, we don't really have that. Do you think that you're making a frown? So I'm assuming you don't really agree.
I think that is an absolutely fabricated case. I mean, I'm just like off the top of my head. I mean, listen, Brock Faber wasn't a first round pick. He's
Right.
okay, I think, right? He's
Yeah.
a pretty good hockey player. Casey Middleton. Here's the thing. This is what I would, whoever's making that argument, I would say this. Go back over the draft. And while Minnesota may not have like a top 10 pick every year, just cumulatively over, say, the last 10 years, let's track how many Minnesota kids go in the first round, compare that geographically to every other, region in North America, and
Right.
see how many first rounders they have.
Yeah.
Without knowing the answer, I would feel really confident in saying that it's equal to, if not greater than any other part of the world. And again, maybe it's not year over year, but I think cumulatively, you're going to see the data is going to show that it's Minnesota is doing just fine and producing world class players. And I would also say this, like, I used to be the hockey director of the North Shore Winter Club, and so like when I was there, we had a couple of young kids that we had free ice, which is pretty rare in my part of the world. And so I would sit at my office that overlooked the parking lot, and every day I would, after school, I'd see a kid carrying his bag in. It was Connor Bedard. And then after him, I'd see another kid carrying his bag. It was Macklin Celebrini. And then, Kent Johnson would be after him. And, there was just something in the water in that part of the world at that time. And I don't think, I think it's a combination of DNA and God's grace that, sometimes certain parts of the world get that much talent and, at the
Some
same.
you can't explain everything.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and I would go watch these kids play. And again, they had no coaches. There was no structure. Like Connor Bedard was just by himself trying to figure out what was ever between his ears and trying to make it come to life on the ice. And
Right.
so I would say if you took a 30,000-foot view and looked at the Minnesota development model, I believe strongly that it stacks up or exceeds anywhere else in the world.
Sure. Um, so if somebody was starting their own club, or we have AAA hockey clubs that we do in the spring and fall here,
Yeah.
or starting a new association, what would be the biggest things that you would tell them as they're writing their framework for how they're going to develop players? Some key things that are non-negotiable to have a successful program.
Sure. I think first off is you need to have a really unified development plan. At least in our experience, again, and this is working with, the top clubs or development programs in the world. They might disagree on the forecheck they use, or they might disagree on how they teach crossovers. But what they do all agree on universally is to have a plan on how you teach crossovers, how you take players from those fundamental skills and build them up into more complex skills, tactics, or systems. And so I think having a long-term plan is critical. I think making sure that the people that are teaching that plan are very much aligned in the language they use, the frameworks they use to teach things. The details, great examples. Like if, Miles, if you and I wanted to teach kids how to do crossovers, right? The way we teach kids to do crossovers isn't to get them to skate, around the face-off circles. The way we teach them to do crossovers is to get their inside shoulder up and back. It's to counterbalance. It's to point the belly button towards their inside knee. It's when they cross over to point their toes to their outside skate as if they're cutting their laces on their inside skate. It's those little teaching details. That's what adds up to producing great players. And the coaches have to be aligned, because if you tell them that, if you tell them at U8 to turn right and I tell them at U10 to turn left, it's not going to help a kid's development. So I think having that alignment is really critical. I think the third piece is being overly invested in the fundamental skills. And I think that we're in such a hurry to, jump to the systems and the tactics because we think that's going to help us win games, or it's going to appease parents because parents feel like, gosh, like Miles is out there teaching them how to do a 1-3-1 power play when they're 9. Like Miles must be the best coach in the world. I think the best programs and best coaches overinvest in the fundamental skills. And just in the same way that, Tiger Woods still goes out and shoots 200 chip shots before each round, even as a seasoned pro, or Tom Brady goes out and throws, simple seam routes. I think that those things, having a really solid foundation and allowing kids to master skills, not just acquire them, in the long run pays massive dividends.
Sure. And it's something I struggle with on that last point there. I guess convincing people. The biggest one that we always deal with is the last year of mites for us is a third grade. So right before they go into squirts where they're playing full ice hockey for 30
Sure.
games the next
Yeah,
year. So a lot of coaches want to take the last month or two of the season and teach them where to line up on faceoffs and all this positioning stuff. And to me, it's like my question I always ask is like, what is the opportunity cost of spending time on that when you're losing out on all these skills that we could be enhancing? And I think a lot of people don't realize that how much time it's going to take to teach a right defenseman where to line up every single time on a faceoff is way longer than you think. And the opportunity of cost of that is too great, in my opinion. So
for sure. And I would say that, squirt hockey is very similar to beer league hockey. You don't win at those levels because you line up for the face off the right way. You win at those levels because you got more players that can shoot, skate, and pass than the other
right,
team. And
exactly.
those fundamental skills they'll show up on the scoreboard more than face off alignment or any other, I think, tactical.
Sure.
That's my opinion.
All right. Well, this has been great. I got one more fun question for you before I
Sure.
let you go. If you could have a podcast guest, living or live, that your number one get, who would it be?
Oh man, that is a great question. Well, I would say I'm going to answer with two. So anybody that listens to the Glass Note podcast knows that I am a huge Nick Saban fan and probably the biggest Crimson Tide fan north of the 49th parallel. So I would say from a coaching perspective, Nick Saban, hands down. I think outside of that, I'm a big fan of music. I've long been an admirer of Rick Rubin, who's a music producer.
Yeah.
And he's written a great book. I would highly recommend coaches. It's an easy read. It's called The Art of Creativity. I think there's so many parallels to how we think about coaching, and it really showcases that coaching is much more an art than it is a science, and that we each have the ability. And I think that's the fun part, to put our own spin on it. So he might be my non-coaching specific guest, but
Nice. I
great
like
question.
it. I love it. All right. You want to give one more kind of plug on where people can find you and sign up and all that good stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Just it's simple. Go to thecoachsite.com. You can sign up for a free user account. Associations can sign up for free group accounts, and there's a ton of value there. And if you choose to, if you want to dive into some of our exclusive content, there is a subscription. But again, I would just recommend that coaches, administrators, parents, players sign up for a free user account, get started, and there's a ton of great stuff for you to explore once you're signed up.
All right. Thank you so much for the time. We really appreciate it. I know you're a busy guy, so thanks a lot.
You bet. Thanks, Miles. Cheers.